I'm very impressed that we're all together early in the morning to talk about sustainable development. The truth is I do see crowds like this early in the morning twice a week, but that's only because the students are getting graded. And you're here because you want to discuss this. There are no grades involved today. So I'm really especially grateful to be here. I want to thank all of the sponsors. I want to thank Minister Carlson in particular for joining us. That's a great honor for me and a great pleasure, especially with the leadership role she will be playing that we'll be talking about during this morning. But I think we're here because we know that the topic of sustainable development isn't just a matter of something nice and interesting for us, but is a drama. I think probably the biggest drama that the world will face in the coming generation. And it's a drama that has been gradually building. Of course, it was something that was already recognized and pioneered first here in Stockholm 40 years ago. So we're here on the 40th anniversary of the first World Summit on the environment. And of course, we have just finished the 20th anniversary of a very important Rio Earth Summit and met in Rio, and some of the conclusions from that meeting are really at the center of what we want to discuss today. But I think it's fair to summarize our situation as saying that despite 40 years of global high political recognition of the challenge of sustainable development, we have made desperately little progress, and in fact, in some ways, have made no progress whatsoever on some of the core challenges, probably of which climate change is number one. It is now, 116 years since a rather clever Swedish chemist proved what was going to happen with climate change. It's not as if this is new science. Mr. Arrhenius already demonstrated in 1896 that a doubling of the carbon concentration in the atmosphere would raise temperatures on the planet by his calculation of an average of around 3 degrees centigrade or 3 to 5 degrees centigrade. He got it right on the back of the envelope in 1896, which is not bad, by the way, since he had to do it by hand and he had to do it for the first time. But we've known about this for a long time. What he didn't know, of course, in 1896, and what he got completely wrong, was the economics of it. We can forgive him that, but he thought that it would take about 700 years to have a carbon doubling. And it was very hard to foresee the era of not only modern economic growth for more than a century, completely changing the Earth's equation, but also when he was making his remarkable calculations, the world population was probably about 1.7 billion, I would guess, at the time. It only reached 2 billion in 1930, and by the end of the century had reached more than 6 billion, and last Halloween it reached 7 billion according to the UN clock. And we're on a pace where population is expected to reach 8 billion by 2024 and 8 billion by 2024 and 9 billion by 2044. This is really extraordinary, of course, and it is posing social and political and environmental and economic challenges that are unprecedented. So for young people here, this is your generation's challenge, in my view, without question. And it is an unavoidable challenge. It's also an unprecedented challenge. The things we're going to be talking about this morning do not have answers right now. It is not just a matter of political will, though political will is very important. We actually don't know what to do about this situation, in my opinion. We have a lot of potential answers. There are a lot of good ideas, but nothing has been shown at scale that can really work in many areas, though there's good reason to believe that such solutions can be found. What I think is absolutely the case, however, is we've not been working very hard on the solutions up until now. We have been working rather lackadaisically on debating words in treaties and wondering about what's binding, what's monitorable, what's verifiable, and spending years on end debating words. But we have not been very active in finding solutions. Now, living in Stockholm, you'll have, I believe, a bit of an optical illusion, because this is one of the few places on the planet that actually is working on things. And though even Sweden can do more, Sweden already does more than just about all the rest of the world. And it's even tempting to say almost all the rest of the world combined. If you step outside of Sweden, if you happen to live in my weird country, the United States, you will find that not only is there insufficient problem solving, there is about half the country that doesn't even believe it's a problem. And we have a political process that is absolutely determined not to even talk about these issues. So if the word climate comes up once between now and November, it will be an accident. It will be probably related to the climate of hope or something, not the climate of the Earth's environment. It will be retracted or clarified quickly by a spokesperson because these are issues not to be discussed. And that's pretty weird, by the way, for a country that is a major part of the world economy still. So this morning we're going to, I hope, brainstorm about what to do about this situation. Not so much about the underlying science, though I want to say a few words about that myself, and we have two absolutely outstanding scientific leaders who are going to be speaking in a moment, but about how to think about the problem solving and a world in which we're so deeply entrained in a non-sustainable direction that we have not figured out how to move the needle, despite 40 years of talking and I would say 20 years of really outstanding international treaties, but that just haven't delivered on their promise. So let me start with a recent observation of one of my esteemed colleagues at the Earth Institute. We're lucky to host at the Earth Institute of Columbia the Goddard Institute of Space Studies, which is NASA's leading atmospheric science unit, and it is housed, strangely enough for NASA, at 113th Street and Broadway. For those of you who watch Seinfeld, it's just above Tom's Restaurant. And inside GIS, as we call it, we have a remarkable team of scientists led by James Hansen, who is our most famous climate scientist and the one who first testified to the U.S. Congress in 1988 that we're in trouble. And so that itself is 24 years ago since his testimony. And when you look at what he said, he almost nailed it to the decimal point also, the events that would transpire since then. Recently, he's talked about the new climate dice, meaning that weather, of course, is a random variable. The kind of weather we get day to day is like rolling the dice. And sometimes it rolls warm, sometimes it rolls cold, sometimes it rolls dry, and sometimes it rolls wet. But what counts is the frequency distribution of those occurrences. And the new climate dice, says Hansen, are loaded dice. We're no longer getting the kinds of averages that we experienced throughout long periods of time in the Holocene. The whole distribution of probabilities of various aspects of climate, temperature, precipitation, and extreme events, is changing, and it's changing dramatically, and it's changing before our eyes. So this is a map of Jim's from a paper published a couple of weeks ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And it shows on this set of maps for different years, starting in 1955 in the upper left to 2011 in the lower right, simply the temperature anomalies in degrees centigrade. So you start with the baseline of 1951 to 1980, and then compare the actual temperatures on the surface of all over the surface of the planet compared to the average of that 30-year period. And where there are dark reds, this means that it's hotter than normal, and where there are blues, it means it's cooler than normal. And if you go to the top left in 1955, which is during that sample mean period, you see there are anomalies of blues and reds. Of course, by the time you get to 2011 in the lower right, it's almost all red, meaning that the Earth is warmer almost everywhere and significantly warmer. What Hansen has done, though, is to also look at the variation, to look at the whole probability distribution of what is occurring. And this now shows the same anomalies, but in units of standard deviation, taking into account the natural variability of the surface of the planet. And so now a variable 3, which is the dark red, no longer means 3 degrees centigrade, it means 3 standard deviations above the mean. 3 standard deviations above the mean is an extraordinary anomaly. It's an extreme event. It's something that happens plus or minus 3 standard deviations about 18 times out of 1,000, 0.18% probability. And you see up in 1955, there were, during the period shown, this is June, July, August for hot and cold areas, there were a few hot places on the planet, but not very many. So there were extreme events, as there are any time in a climate system, simply by the random distribution of the dice, of the weather outcomes. By 2011, however, what you see is not only is it warmer, but extreme events cover between 5 and 15% of the Earth's surface. This is absolutely extraordinary. What used to happen 18 times out of, sorry, I said that wrong. 18 times out of 10,000, sorry, about 2 times out of 1,000, I should have said, for 3 standard deviations, is now happening roughly 50 times out of 1,000 of the roll of the dice. We're seeing now extreme events as a normal occurrence on the planet, meaning what used to be extraordinarily rare 30 years ago is now at a frequency somewhere on the planet, on average about 5 to 10%, and in some periods 15% of the world covered by 3 standard deviation events. This has happened within a half a century. The pace of arrival of these extreme events is absolutely unprecedented, shocking, and being felt everywhere. This is the same representation, not on a map, but in terms of the income distribution. When you see the shift to the right of the income distribution, for example, in terms of temperatures, these are in units not of degrees, but again in units of standard deviations of the 1951 to 1980 period, what we're seeing is a world of extremes now. And this is being felt everywhere. In the United States, of course, we have felt it in two absolutely dramatic ways ourselves in the last year. The period July 2011 to June 2012, shown by the bar on the far right, is the hottest 12 months in U.S. recorded history. So we've just gone through the hottest 12-month consecutive period, and July 2012 was the hottest month in all of U.S. recorded history of any month. And this is an example of the extremes. And we are experiencing the worst drought in modern history. More than half of the U.S. counties in the United States have been declared a drought emergency this year. There has been a major loss of the Farm Belt, which is the American Midwest, shown in the dark red, which means that it's also the drought area. The American Midwest is the breadbasket for the country and for much of the world. Maize and soybeans, this has been a devastating year. You think someone might have taken notice, by the way, in the United States. Actually, I can give you good news and bad news. The good news is they did take notice in Texas that there was an extreme drought. The bad news was that the response of the state legislature was to have a 3-day prayer weekend for rain last April. And I kid you not, I live in that country. And this is really actually quite a serious matter. The governor of the state, Governor Perry, who mercifully was a candidate for president only for a few days, it seemed, or a few weeks before the rest of the country had a view, denies climate change at a period where this is hitting his state the worst in modern history, and where the response is completely no response. Now, what is happening here? Partly, of course, there is a matter of ideology, I suppose. There is probably a whiff of fundamentalism involved, but there's something more fundamental than fundamentalism, and that is that Texas is an oil state, and politics in the United States is oil-driven. And in general, I would say the oil industry is the world's most powerful industry. It's the cash-rich industry. It is the most influential industry politically. And in the United States, oil, gas, and coal dominate our politics. And we have a political system, as you know, where the U.S. Supreme Court cannot tell the difference between free speech and anonymous corporate contributions to campaign financing. And I kid you not, they literally see no difference of those two. And in such a milieu, it's actually very hard to get anything more than a 3-day prayer weekend, despite a drought that is of such intensity that it is driving up world food prices and contributing, no doubt, to the next months and years of political instability and hardship in many parts of the world. This is our maize crop in Indiana. This August, a tremendous amount has been wiped out, maybe 20% of the total crop. Of course, the U.S. is not the only place with anomalies. As I said, at any point now in the world, 5 to 10, sometimes even 15% of the world's surface are experiencing precipitation or temperature 3 standard deviation anomalies at this point. I myself spent a lot of the last year both in the Horn of Africa, where last year's drought was one of the most severe in modern history, and where, of course, the drought led to millions of people's lives at imminent risk, many tens of thousands at minimum of people dying of the drought, and probably hundreds of thousands with all of the indirect effects on disease burden. And then 6 months later came the drought in the Sahel. And for me, quite striking, because both in East Africa and West Africa, projects that we coordinate in villages in dryland areas were overcome by violence associated with famine and with hunger. The village in northeast Kenya where we work is quite close to the Somalia border. Somalia and Kenya are now in war, mass refugee movements. Even to provision that area with basic supplies meant that convoys of our trucks carrying medicines, for example, were being routinely shot at, and it became too dangerous even to undertake the normal project. In West Africa, I'll never forget that in January of this year, I was having a wonderful dinner under the stars with the Prime Minister of Mali and with the governor of Ségou, which is one of the districts where one of our projects is located. And the governor sitting next to me was saying, "Mr. Sachs, it's really dry this year and we really have problems. And there's a lot of violence in my district. Can you help get some money for bore wells?" Because the pastoralists have no water points for their animals. And they're coming over the farmlands now. They're trying to get to the Niger River. And it's a lot of violence. Can you do something for me, Mr. Sachs? And as usual, I went home. I tried to start discussions. Everything moved slowly in the international system. 6 weeks later, there was a coup in the south that overthrew the government that we were closely cooperating with. The army disbanded immediately. Rebels in the north took over the north. And in our site near Timbuktu, the office was overrun, pillaged, trucks stolen, and our people fled for their lives, literally on the river, on boat, for 2 days till they could get to safety. And you feel it. You know, if there's extreme drought in an impoverished area, this is what is going to happen. It's not. It is not rocket science. As I often say, you don't need a PhD to figure it out. And in fact, if you have one, it hurts. It causes you to study the obvious for 20 years without understanding what's really going on. A few years ago, using CIPRI data, the Stockholm Institute of Peace Research, I just made an overlay of conflict areas and drylands because I believe that the drylands really are our canary in the mine shaft. They are the part of the world most vulnerable to climate change because they're already so dry that a little bit of drying pushes them into unhabitability, unsociability, and conflict. And there is indeed a striking overlap of conflict zones and dryland zones in the world. So next time you think about Mali, Somalia, Yemen, Afghanistan, and so forth, this is not, in my opinion, about Islamic this or Islamic that or extremism this. This is about hunger and drylands and demographic pressures and extreme pressures that make it impossible to hold societies together. And we do not have a system internationally to even recognize these facts, much less to act upon them in a timely way. So in Rio 1992, 20 years after Stockholm, there was a remarkably successful conference, surely the high water mark of global environmentalism up to today. And at that conference, 3 tremendous treaties were signed. I assign them to my students all the time because I regard them as well-drafted, thoughtful, intelligent demonstration of what the world can negotiate when it puts its mind to it. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. 3 tremendous documents. When we came back to Rio this June, 20 years later, Nature magazine did a story grading Rio, and I think it got it right when it gave 3 Fs to these 3 treaties, 3 fails. Not one of these treaties has been implemented. All 3 have led to 20 years of global negotiations, but not one of them has done its job. Of course, in the United States, the American right wing decided that preserving species was a violation of private property rights, so we never even signed the Convention on Biological Diversity. One can thank Newt Gingrich and his contract with America for that. We never even came to the conclusion that biological diversity is a responsibility that supersedes the individual right of a landowner to destroy it. When it comes to climate change, the U.S. did actually ratify the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in November 1992. And think about it, an American Republican president signing these treaties. Almost unimaginable. This time we couldn't even get an American Democratic Party president to go to Rio. It was felt by him to be so politically dangerous he wanted to have nothing to do with it. But then we had a Republican president actually signing the treaties. The Framework Convention was ratified in November 1992, and that was the last affirmative action the United States has taken on climate change. Nothing for 20 years. Not a single action passed by the Senate, except for one unanimous vote, 96-0, in the Byrd-Hagel Amendment saying, we will do nothing unless China does something together with us in violation of the terms of the Framework Convention that had been ratified and was under the U.S. Constitution, American law by that point, just 3 years earlier. And the Convention on Desertification is hardly noticed or known by anybody, even though it is exactly in the Drylands regions that the world's worst humanitarian and conflict crises occur. This treaty is a footnote to almost everybody except the specialists, because it's regarded as something esoteric and not of central concern. So I think there are lessons to be drawn. I'm not sure exactly what they are, but one lesson I think is strong, and that is that international law is not sufficient to the task at hand. And the processes that we have globally are not working. This, I think, for sure. And we were discussing yesterday, I have a view watching the negotiations that it's like 193 poker players holding their hands on the climate negotiations, but all their cards are blank because the negotiators don't know what they're negotiating. They don't really know what their national interests are. They don't really know what the technological possibilities are. They don't really know what the trade-offs are. All they know is don't sign anything unless the other person binds them to something else. And we've gone 20 years of legalism, but we've not been able to take practical actions to change direction. So at Rio Plus 20, it was a different environment, of course. We had many fewer heads of state. The President of the United States was not there because the United States is no longer a leader of these issues. It is at best a foot dragger and in practice one of the major obstacles to action in the entire world. And what was there was a massive outpouring of civil society and companies and worried people and tens of thousands of participants. And what has changed absolutely in the last 20 years is that more and more people all over the world know something is terribly deranged, and that the dangers are not about future generations, they're about the here and now, though they're also about future generations. And so I think the mood has changed dramatically, but the sobering reality is that our processes are not working. And therefore, if one tries to find the value added of the Rio Plus 20 and our current environment, it really is about the search for at least additional ways to gain traction on what is already the world's greatest challenge, albeit one that is hardly addressed in an era of daily crises. We can't get to the real long-term challenges right now, but there is a palpable search and desire for a new direction. And I would summarize it by saying that at least now the notion is we have to bring society into the story. This is not going to be concluded by intergovernmental negotiations. This is not going to be solved by international law. I do not want to dismiss international law. It plays its role. And I certainly admire the secretariats of these treaties and the work that they do. But I think we have to have strong, complementary, new approaches to these issues if we're going to have a chance of succeeding. So one of the notions is that we need to move to a new set of global goals that in which humanity, in a much more direct, intensive, and spirited way, can embrace the challenges that we face. And I've thought about this in a phrase of moving from the MDGs to the SDGs, from Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals, reflecting in part on my own experience with the Millennium Development Goals, which I've been living and breathing for the last decade. There, too, the commitments to fight extreme poverty have not succeeded, certainly in all of their dimensions. But with the Millennium Development Goals, I would say, more than with the environmental treaties, for example, the goals of fighting poverty have somehow been grasped within societies by civil society organizations and by governments in a more purposeful way. The strange thing about the Millennium Development Goals is that, unlike almost all other UN goals, they actually have a shelf life still a dozen years after they were promulgated. We still talk about them, but even more than us talking about them, poor countries talk about them all the time. It's almost impossible to be in a developing country any day and not see in the newspaper one or two seminars on that day about the Millennium Development Goals, a statement by a minister about the Millennium Development Goals, a measure of progress or not progress towards one of the goals, and so forth. Rather unusual and rather extraordinary. What is it about the goals that made a difference? First, people do care about staying alive and do care about extreme poverty, and therefore the goals were about something understandable and gripping. Second, I believe they were clear and graspable. I don't know how it happened exactly, but it did happen. That out of a process of preparing for the Millennium Summit in September 2000, these goals were adopted internally and put on the table by Kofi Annan, and the world adopted them. One of the realities was the world didn't know they were, the world's leaders didn't know they were adopting Millennium Development Goals. They were adopting a big declaration. Then afterwards, the goals were excerpted and said, look what you adopted, 8 of them, 8 goals, and that became the MDGs in 2001, actually. Unlike Agenda 21, for example, which was the comparable set of goals out of Rio, Agenda 21 ran to 350 pages. It is forgotten by everybody now, unfortunately, except the experts and the Republican right wing of the United States. Interesting, by the way, they remember it as the most dangerous thing facing America. The UN's attempt to take away American sovereignty. So it did get somebody's recognition, but it did not get embraced by broad society because 350 pages is a bit much. And it was not good marketing. And it was never boiled down in a way that people could understand and people could embrace. Whereas the Millennium Development Goals, you can actually even remember them. A child can remember them. A child can recite them. A child can be asked to write an assignment in school about them in third grade and actually be able to deliver. And I think that we need similarly sustainable development goals like the Millennium Development Goals that can capture the public's imagination and be a way for a generation in a self-conscious global manner to embrace the biggest challenge that we face. And so we have set in motion now through the Rio Plus 20 process and the legacy of the Millennium Development Goals, which calls for a review next September on recommendations to have post-2015 goals. It's a little bit complicated in terms of all of the legalities and diplomacy because the MDG track talks about post-2015 goals. The Rio Plus 20 track talks about sustainable development goals. It's actually at a technical level 2 processes that needs to come to be one process so that after 2015 there is a set of objectives that the world can grasp and that can become the basis for real problem solving. In my view, if we can get to this notion, and your minister, who will speak shortly, will be part of a core panel impaneled by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to help figure out the way to do this. I believe that the world could, even in its fractious, highly disputatious mood, still agree on some basic principles for the next 15-year period. And I myself have thought about it as 4 key pillars, because sustainable development is really about the triple bottom line, the idea that a decent society is a society that fights poverty, that demands social inclusion, and that respects environmental boundaries. And so the triple bottom line of economy, society, and environment is the essence of sustainable development. I believe, and it's not false flattery at all, that this is what Sweden in its basic national ethos represents. I'm a great admirer of your country and your society and a Scandinavian point of view. It is not, however, an accepted notion in other parts of the world, nor is it an understood notion right now, that a balanced, healthy society balances economy, society, and environment. But I believe that the concept of sustainable development is quite beautiful in that specific sense of the triple bottom line. I add one more feature to that, which is good governance, that we need governance, not just by government, by the way, but good governance of corporations, good governance of universities, good governance of organizations to commit to sustainable development and to transparent, cooperative, participative processes to achieve it. So my view is the SDGs can be boiled down to 4 pillars: ending extreme poverty, socially inclusive societies, environmental sustainability, and good governance for sustainable development. And if the world could somehow get around to these 4 core ideas, I think we'd start to make headway. Now, I've been suggesting for a number of years that in addition to that, we need not only the goals, but the problem solving. It's been my experience in the Millennium Development Goal process that the goals were embraced and then gave rise to an era of creative problem solving. The malariologists raised their hand and said, "We can do that." And the AIDS doctor said, "Oh, we can do that." And the water and sanitation people said, "Oh, we can do that." And a number of technological or behavioral or organizational initiatives got underway because of the goals. When it comes to environmental sustainability, it's going to be tougher than it is with fighting extreme poverty for a basic reason. Fighting extreme poverty under the MDGs is fighting an anomaly. How can it be in the 21st century people are dying of their poverty? That's weird, and it's an anachronism. And you can overcome it because we have the proven technologies to do that. And indeed, we're seeing great progress wherever we make the investments. If we invest in controlling malaria, boom, 10 years, malaria is down by 40% in sub-Saharan Africa. Millions of people are on AIDS treatment. Children in school has soared. You put in the investment, you can get the results. It's going to be trickier to solve the problems for sustainable development because it's not exactly an anachronism or an anomaly that our societies are powered by fossil fuel, for example. That is almost the definition of the modern era. It was the invention of the steam engine that changed the world. It was harnessing coal, oil, and gas that made the modern world economy. Now we have to retool. We don't know how to do that exactly. So solving the SDGs is going to be a tougher challenge, a deeper challenge, a longer-term challenge. It's going to require 2 generations of effort by my estimation. We're going to need 40 years at a minimum to retool the world's power systems to be low-carbon power systems. This isn't a matter of turning off the lights or doing a little bit more energy efficiency. The role of fossil fuel is so deeply seated, the desired economic growth in poor countries is so strong that the equations of carbon emissions are so profoundly adverse right now that we need fundamental systems re-engineering in order to be able to get to where we need to go. So Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has recently honored me and given me a chance to see whether we can help to mobilize expertise, and our 2 Johans together are partners with me on this to see if we can help to create a new global sustainable development solutions network to ramp up dramatically the scale, intensity, and expertise of problem solving to address the core unsolved problems of sustainable development. The ones I would say beyond political will, because political will is the starting point. Or maybe it's the ending point, actually, after the practical solutions are demonstrated. But it's the part of saying, what do we actually do? How do we move? What's feasible? What are the trade-offs? What do we do about some of the toughest issues on the planet? Do we go with nuclear power? Do we go with genetically modified organisms for improved traits of drought resistance, for example? What about geoengineering and so forth? There are a host of absolutely profoundly controversial, difficult issues in front of humanity that need to be addressed, as well as a tremendous amount of systems re-engineering that we haven't even started to do. I won't go through this page except to say there are a lot of issues to discuss. Renewables, nuclear, carbon capture, smart vehicles, new traits on agricultural products, agroecology, smart tillage, microdosing of chemical fertilizers, alternative dietary choices, ocean management ideas, and so forth. There is a two generations of absolutely pivotal, fascinating, unsolved problems that we need to solve, and I hope that can be spurred and inspired by a new generation of goals that can take humanity to where we need to go for safe haven. Thank you very much.
Thank you.